It's good to be here. It's been a while since I've been up to this farm. Usually a lot of the stuff I do is more down south. And so it's a lot of what I do as a wildlife specialist, and this is true in any state, is you're going to do a lot with human-wildlife conflicts. And so a lot of what I do is both with the yard and home, but then also with crops. And Phil asked me to talk a little bit today about some certain species that seem to be more troublesome or maybe increasing at times in this part of the state. One is 13-line ground squirrel. How many people have 13-line ground squirrels? A couple? Some of you probably have them, maybe don't even know. Another one is voles, and so voles, V-O-L-E. We have meadow voles and prairie voles up in this part of the state, and they both can cause problems with crops. And I'm going to touch on a little bit with turkey and some other species at the end if we have time, okay? So, what is a 13-line ground squirrel? They're a lot like tree squirrels, except they're not in trees, they're on the ground, okay? And some people get confused by the name, the 13-line. Those little dots, those count as interrupted lines. So if you counted all the lines and interrupted lines on the back of that squirrel, it's 13, okay? And so they're about the size of a tree squirrel. They could be up to almost a foot long. That includes their tail length, and the tail could be sometimes 5 to almost 6 inches long, okay? But generally they hang out by themselves, although they group as well. So they're kind of in loose colonies and groups. They're not necessarily colonial species like some other rodents or beavers or things like that, okay? But if you have one, you have a lot. That's pretty typical of that, okay? An important part of that is that they hibernate about half the year, okay? And so sometimes in terms of a strategy, if you want to avoid issues with 13-line ground squirrels, getting things planted early is optimal, because a lot of times you can beat that window of time where stuff gets tall enough where they don't like it, okay? They like short grass, they like to see things, they're always close to their burrow entrance, okay? So that's important. In a lot of areas, these things are actually the pest in turf and athletic fields. They like that, okay? Nice fertilized grass, there's a lot of seeds in there for them to eat, and they can see. Okay, they hang out, they like warm sunny days, and they hang out during the day, but they have burrow systems, okay? And these burrow systems can extend sometimes 10 to even close to 20 meters, all right? And within that main channel, they've got little tunnels that go out side to side laterally from that standpoint. They typically have a couple openings, so a lot of times you'll see an opening, okay? And then you might find an opening about another 20 feet or so within that. That's pretty typical. Another thing what they do is they tend to disperse the soil around the opening so they aren't as obvious, okay? So like a groundhog burrow, or if you've ever seen like a badger burrow, there's a lot of dirt and things, soil kicked around there, they're pretty conspicuous. These things not so much, okay? The other thing is they make these emergency burrows, okay? And so these are dead-end, single tunnel burrows, maybe a couple feet long, that they just have to kind of, if they get in trouble, they go in there for a few minutes and they pop their heads out and check out what's going on, okay? I've been told you can actually capture them in these burrows pretty easily. John Whitaker was a professor at ISU for years and years, wrote a lot of things about mammals, and he and his students, they captured over 70 of them just by pouring buckets of water in those emergency burrows. They'd pop out and they'd grab them. So if you're looking for something extra to do, that might be something to do, right? I imagine most of you don't have a lot of free time on your hands, though. All right, so just kind of interesting from that standpoint. So what the heck do these things do, okay? They're primarily seed eaters, okay? So they will eat crop seeds. And this is a little bit difficult to tell in this light, but here's a corn seedling. There used to be a seedling there, that all got dug out, okay? So they dig out the seeds and they'll consume them, and they'll do that even when the corn seedlings are at the early stages of growth. A lot of species will do that. Blackbirds will do that, chipmunks will do that, tree squirrels will do that. They'll dig around there and just consume the seed and not necessarily consume the plant itself, okay? The other thing, though, is with a lot of these things, and it's hard to quantify, but there's been some work done with voles, is they also eat weed seeds, and so they can kind of be helpful regarding that, but probably not to the extent that offsets the damage, right? So sometimes that can take place. Okay. So that's 13 line ground squirrels. I'm gonna go through just a couple of these species groups, and then we're gonna talk about management strategies and what we can do about it, how to go about it, okay? So voles are rodents, okay? So voles are a little bit different than ground squirrels. They're a lot smaller, they're short-lived, they do not hibernate, and they have many litters per year. Ground squirrels only have 1 litter per year. They're typically gonna have 6 to 8 young in a litter, okay? These guys right here, they reproduce the whole year. So if they've got resources, they're in there out underneath the snow, they're gonna reproduce, okay? And that's because everything eats them. All right, coyotes eat them, birds of prey eat them, fox eat them, raccoon, a lot of different things are gonna eat them, snakes, all those kinds of things. They're basically like mice, but they're a little bit bigger. They have short furry tails and short ears, okay? And so otherwise they look very similar to mice. They're more brownish than gray like mice are, okay? Eat a lot of different things. And so not only do these guys eat seeds, but they also eat a lot of green vegetation. And from a crop standpoint, that's important, especially with the early growth. So if you're talking about soybeans, anywhere from, planting up to, when you got V4 to V6, probably somewhere along lines, right? From that standpoint. So it just depends on what's going on there. But they also do roots and tubers, so they can dig down, and sometimes they can chew around plants and chew the roots off, okay, which makes those plants much less likely to grow or grow properly. And a lot of them will actually switch to woody stuff. So these are not only a problem in crop fields, but they're also a big problem in orchards, in tree plantings, anything like that where you've got young trees that you're worried about them chewing around and girdling those trees right at the base of the tree. Okay, so they're active year-round, all times, day or night. They're always doing things, okay? And basically, anywhere from a tenth of an acre to an acre. So if you've got good vole habitat, and I'll show you what that looks like, you can have a lot of voles in a very small area. Okay, and if that good vole habitat is adjacent to crops, that's a potential for some conflicts there, okay? Most of the time, people are familiar with them. Well, I skipped ahead, sorry. So again, what voles like is really heavy grass cover, dense, so you've got like some clover in there, you've got grasses in there, maybe some different wildflowers in there, okay? And it's very dense, and that's good because it holds moisture. It provides them overhead cover, particularly from raptors and birds of prey, okay? But they can forage in that cover, forage for seeds, succulent green vegetation, those kinds of things. That's really important, okay? So they're a little bit different than the ground squirrels. Ground squirrels like it low, not so dense. Voles like it pretty dense. So they're opposites regarding that. There's been some work with cover crops that I'll talk a little bit about, but cover crops are actually pretty good vole habitat. The ones that tend to mat and lodge are really better for them. So if you think about it, a vole is really small. So usually if I'm talking about wildlife habitat, for example, and we're talking about things like bobwhite quail, we don't want that to happen. We like, from a wildlife standpoint, we like the erect plants that have structure, that provide space in between those plants, but provide overhead cover. Voles are a little bit different, that they like it matted down because that's like a little tunnel for them, and so they can burrow in that matted grass and be totally concealed in that cover. So they don't mind getting around through that. Most wildlife species, that's not the case. Plus it prevents access to seeds and insects that a lot of wildlife like to have, like with bare soil underneath cover, okay? So it's a little bit different. So they're little opposites regarding that. There's been some work with cover crops, and specifically with orchards and vineyards, and a lot of this work's been done in the Northeast or even out west. And what they found is that the clover mixes, the cover crop mixes, they had higher densities of voles, okay? And so I don't know, how many people have cover crops here? I'm just curious. I know it's a growing thing, several people. Do any of you plant clover in your mixes, or is it mostly cereal rye? Or cereal rye is the most common one in Indiana. But some people have different mixes. Some have brassica in them, things like that, from that standpoint. So this would be optimal vole habitat. Not a lot of woody stuff around, although there's some, but really it's thick, dense cover, a lot of grass, a lot of wildflower, things like that, okay, from that standpoint. So, but you can imagine on working lands, we can sometimes have something similar to this in terms of hay fields, pastures, field borders, those kinds of things, okay? Or even cover crops in a way, right? So you can kind of think of it in terms of those things. The species that we have are meadowvole. Again, meadowvoles are common in the northern 2/3 part of the state. And then that's all, I forgot I had pictures of voles in here. So that's what a vole looks like. It's just a big fat mouse, brown mouse, okay? Pretty good looking thing there. And then you have prairie vole. So again, very similar, although they're more common in the southern part, but we do have them in the northwestern part of the state, and they're definitely more up here. They tend to be more diverse in their diet from that standpoint, but again, both these things are found in cover crops. They're found in soybean fields at times, especially if it was cover cropped, and they do feed on those. Sometimes when you're looking in a field, and so if you're scouting for damage, I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, but most people who are familiar with voles, their familiarity tends to be in lawns. And so vole populations tend to boom and bust. And so in some years, you can be overrun with voles, but the next 2 or 3 years, the population just crashes, okay? So there's several different species that happens to. Voles is one of those groups. And so in years that you have snow cover during the winter time, and especially if you have a high vole population year that year, then you start, the snow melts and you get all these little runways all throughout there. So these are basically just paths that the voles make. If you've ever had any kind of small mammal damage or frequent your yard, voles will do this. You can even see worn paths from things like chipmunks going to and from their burrow entrances in your yard, and so that's pretty common, okay? These are hard to find in a crop field, okay? Sometimes, but what is more easy to find are the burrow entrances. So you can think of kind of a burrow entrance. So if you've got a cover crop that you've terminated, and after that termination, before planting, you walked some lines, some transects in that field, just kind of looking around, you're going to find something similar to this, where basically it's like a silver dollar-sized hole, and that's a vole burrow entrance. That's what that is. Okay, so that's what a good sign in a crop field would be. So again, I talked about that. They really have a lot of litters from that standpoint. Some of the density estimates are at 4,000 per acre. That's a real far extreme. There was one study that was not even in this part of the country that found that. But again, hundreds per acre is pretty typical. Okay, and so if you think about a vole that can eat in excess of its body weight every day, and you've got hundreds of those in an acre, that can really add up, especially in those early stages of growth. So they can be quite impactful when it comes to yields and things like that. So the time you typically have vole damage is from planting up to about 28 days. Once it gets too big, the voles really don't, they're going to move on to other things. There are other things in a crop field that they can eat, from weed seeds to weeds, smaller plants, that kind of stuff, okay? Soybeans, they tend to eat throughout the year, although again, that early stage of growth is really, really important. On the older ones, they can sometimes feed on newly formed leaves or pods if they're able to climb up there and reach them from that standpoint, okay? But again, the early damage is really key when it comes to these. The tricky thing about voles is they can be hit or miss when you're comparing fields, okay? And they can be hit or miss within a field depending on the year because their populations fluctuate. So it can be really tricky to kind of, if you're out scouting for these things, to really kind of determine what's going on from that standpoint, okay? So there's different ways we can figure it out, like the runways and the burrow entrances, plant clippings and droppings. Though that would be really difficult to assess on a large scale. That would be more for a homeowner kind of a deal. But again, small green areas or weedy areas. And so if you've got some areas that look different in your field, that would be a place to look for voles, because it's different because of their feeding behavior from that standpoint. So in regards to both of these mammals, 13-line ground squirrels and vole species, there's several different things we can do. Toxicants, which is basically a poison. You put out a poison bait, they consume the bait, they die. Okay, so that's one thing we can do. Fumigants, both for crop and non-crop areas, are a possibility. But a lot of what we do is probably more in terms of cultural things. So doing vegetation management, maybe changing how we manage our cropland, but also even adjacent habitats. That can be very important as well. So probably the most common toxicant for small mammals is zinc phosphate. It's been around for a long time. It's very effective. A lot of times these are sold in and around buildings. So if you've ever, a lot of you probably have those around your farm buildings as well. So within 100 foot of buildings, you can use bait stations in some of these products to target voles, and that's more of a winter population kind of a thing where you're trying to limit the growth the next year by knocking it down when the population is relatively low, okay? There are some labeled for croplands though. But the thing is, it's really good. It does a good job and it has a wide target range. So in other words, it kills a lot of different mammals, but it also kills a lot of different birds. And because of that, the concern with toxicants is usually non-targets. That's what you're most concerned about. You don't want to put something out there and have something consume it that you don't want to consume it, and then they die. Okay, that's not a good thing. And you can think of domestic pets would be the same thing, right? So if you've got dogs and cats and things running around, that would be an issue, okay? So that's why that is. So these things are always delivered either in bait stations that are only small mammals can get into, or they're directly underground, either in the burrows or in a furrow of a planting site. That's what you're doing, okay? So there are a couple that are labeled for no-till corn. None are labeled for no-till soybeans, okay? So tillage is actually a really good thing you can do to kill voles, okay? Deep tillage. Their tunnel system is not very deep. And so if you do tillage, that's good to prevent vole damage, okay? The flip side of that is that goes against some other things we're trying to do with no-till and other things, right? And so that's an obvious kind of thing what we can do, okay? But so in no-till corn, you can do this. It's one application. You can either do it prior to planting, or you can do it at planting if you're set up to do that from that standpoint. And the key is it must be covered by soil. So you're covering these things in the furrow where the seeds are at. So basically, if that animal's going down there digging up seeds and consuming them, they're going to dig up some of this stuff, consume it, and they're going to die. So that's the idea of what we're trying to do here. And these two products are actually labeled for both species of voles and 13-line ground squirrels, okay? But remember, whenever you're using any kind of a pesticide, you're reading and following the label, right? And especially that's true with toxicants, because toxicants kill a lot of different stuff. And a lot of times the concern there is especially with endangered species. So the only thing you really kind of have to be worried about in this part of the state is Franklin's ground squirrel. That's actually a state endangered species. It looks very similar to the 13-line ground squirrel, except it looks more like a tree squirrel. It's all kind of brown and gray, and there's no stripes or anything like that on it from that standpoint. But again, that's a prairie species. It's super, super rare from that standpoint, but that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your head whenever you're doing something like this. Where's Nikki at? She told me she'd give me the time. Okay. So if you look on the label, so again, I just grabbed this off the label yesterday to kind of just show you. So basically, depending on what your row spacing is with your corn, from that standpoint and the rate you want to apply, that's kind of like it shows you how to calibrate that with your planter. Okay. So again, nothing's labeled for soybeans. One option might be to kind of just rotate between beans and corn, right? And so if you're doing a rotation, and a lot of people are, from that standpoint, that's a good thing. The problem is the challenge in this regard, especially if you're dealing with voles, is you want to time that rotation, ideally, that you're going to do when the voles are high. So if you got a lot of voles, you know, and you apply the toxicant, then you're going to be more likely to have more of an impact from that standpoint. Okay. Your other thing you can do with any field, and particularly in no-till soybeans, because you don't have any other options when it comes to toxicants, is to consider adjacent areas. And so there are things that are labeled for non-crop areas, and so things like filter strips, or if you've got some just some fescue drives and things like that around fields, you can certainly apply products in those kinds of areas as well. So that's it for toxicants. Fumigants, there's a couple ways we can approach fumigants. One is directly into the burrows, and the other is you do the same thing, but there's two different ways to do it. There are the gas cartridges, the sodium nitrate and potassium nitrate. They're different ones, and so you can actually put those in burrows. Those are much more applicable to 13-line ground squirrels. It's not really worth your time to try and find vole burrows and do that. That's really not reasonable for most folks, even though it's labeled for all three of those species. Those products are from that standpoint. But the other thing you can do is, and those are non-crop only, so you can't use those gas cartridges on cropland. So those would be adjacent habitats and things like that. The aluminum phosphide, that's a restricted use pesticide, and so that's actually labeled for cropland use. And the way it works is basically it reacts with water and creates a poisonous gas. And so you can see this gas. And so whenever you're using any kind of a fumigant in burrow systems, there's a couple things to consider. One is soil moisture is good. So if you have really dry soils, they're not going to be effective, and that's especially true of this aluminum phosphide because it reacts with that water to create that gas. It needs that. It's just not going to function very well without it. So you'd probably have to use a higher rate, which means more money, okay? So soil moisture is good for this. The other thing is you want to be sure you're sealing all the burrows. So when you read the directions on these types of fumigants, is you've got to kind of push it into the burrow system. You've got to block the entrance with, they suggest crumpled paper or anything that'll prevent soil from going down in there and covering that tablet or the pellets, and then covering up with soil. And so you're going to do that, and then you're going to start to see that working. And so that's, again, it's a lot of work, right? So if you've got a small area that you've got some 13-line ground squirrels and you're concerned about them kind of getting worse, this might be something to consider. The thing about this stuff, though, is it's kind of a pain to work with. It's a restricted use pesticide. You can't do it within 100 feet of buildings. You've got to have a warning sign. So when you do it, and then the application extension is 2 days after you apply it, and then you can take the signs down. But then you've also got to create a fumigation plan because this stuff's some pretty nasty stuff, so there's some restrictions that go into it. So most people in this part of the world don't use this type of product. It's much more common use in areas like Nebraska and Kansas and some of those places in South Dakota where you've got some serious ground squirrel populations and issues and things, okay? So I mentioned cover crops. Cover crops is kind of a special situation, and I think Indiana ranks something like 3rd or 4th in the country in terms of the amount of cover crop usage, so it's really increased over the recent years. And so there's some special considerations to think about it. One, and especially with regarding voles. And so there's actually been some work done looking at how do voles use this type of habitat, how does it relate to other species, particularly raptors, and how does that relate to soybean damage and vole populations, okay? And so there's actually been studies done in Indiana looking at that. And so they were doing some scouting, and in this particular study, this was in the greater Lafayette area. They looked at different size fields, anywhere from 25 acres or so up to over 200 acres, okay? And so they did some scouting in this field. They trapped for voles to assess vole population density. And they also looked at damage to plants after the fact later on in the growing season. And so all these fields had cover crops of cereal rye, okay? And so once the crop was terminated, they did this scouting. So depending on the year, because weather's different year to year, you're talking about April-ish, March to April, or April to May-ish, and depending on the years that they did this. And so what they found is that the vole burrow entrances, and they limited it to different things, but that was an easy thing that you can walk a transect in a given time and be able to spot these. It's like anything else. Once you kind of know what you're looking for, it's pretty easy, okay? But they were unable to calculate any usable index. So in other words, how many of those burrow entrances on these transects in this field should I be thinking about doing some type of a control measure that's going to cost me money, okay? There's been some work done looking at vole colonies. And so if you've got 5 or more vole colonies in an acre, then that's an indication that you're going to have to do some type of control work because chances are it's going to cost you money, okay? The problem with that is that's a lot of work to really estimate that and do that. That's not a reasonable thing for farmers to do, okay? So it's really useless in regard to that. So they were trying to do something that was more useful, okay? But what they did find was the more burrow entrances you had in the field, that was related, and that was the highest predictive value for damage, Okay, so the more burrows you had, the more damage. Even though they saw sign and stuff, they had trouble catching voles in some of these fields. In a lot of fields, they didn't catch any, even though there was tons of sign and things around. So it's kind of strange from that standpoint. So it's a good thing to do. One thing to think about is cover crop selection. There is no research on this regarding soybeans and cover crops, okay? But based on some of that work done in orchards, and we know that clovers and alfalfa are preferred forages for voles, that those probably aren't good choices of species in a cover crop mix if you have a history of vole issues or you're concerned about voles, okay? You want to do something else. What about predators? And so this is something that like a lot of folks talk about over the years. A lot of times it's people who are against using pesticides or trapping. They just say, well, we got natural predators out there, let them kind of take care of things. And historically, it's like, well, if you've got high populations of, or high densities of voles and other animals like that, it's going to be really hard for predators to actually control those at some kind of a level that's desirable for us, right? Nikki, how am I doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay. I couldn't see her out there waving. So there's actually been some work done on this in cover crops. And so this was the same Rob Swihart, who's a professor in our department. They were looking at the use of artificial perches. So in other words, in soybean fields, while they have cover crops, can you put out 3 artificial perches and increase predation in those fields to actually reduce vole populations that actually equates to reduced damage to soybeans that following growing season, okay? And so they did them from different edges. Basically, the take-home message is they use these things, but they didn't use them very frequently, okay? And overall use was probably because there wasn't a lot of voles in these fields. So in other words, there's no reason for them to use a perch if the prey items really aren't that available. They're going to focus in areas where there's more food, right? That's a foraging efficiency thing, okay? We're going to go where the food's easy to get. Animals are the same way, right? So think of it that way. So densities are really important. It turns out the years they did these studies, vole populations were kind of on a low cycle, so that didn't help them too much. If they did a third year, that probably would have been better. Okay, so the problem with it, so it's good in the way that they were using these perches, and so there could be potential there to this be part of a solution, but the problem is that you can only use them temporarily. So in other words, once the cover crops were going to be terminated, you have to remove these perches, okay, and terminate the crop, and then they're going to plant. And so the time of the year that you can use these is really limited from that standpoint. The other part to that is populations of voles spike in the spring. So once resources are plentiful, even though they were reproducing in the wintertime, they're going to do it more so in the spring, okay? There's a lot more stuff going on, okay? So that's a problem. The other thing too is cover crop quality is really important. So not only, you know, they were looking at cereal rye, but if you've got different types of more dense vegetation, that's going to be really problematic because that's really good vole habitat and predators are going to be useful, less efficient in catching them. So there might be opportunities to do more research looking at, is there a way that we can manage that cover crop in terms of maybe something like one mowing or something like that? Could that really affect efficiency of predators at catching these things? Because if you think about it, in a perfect world, if we can just have some of these birds kill all these things and we don't have to worry about a thing, that would be ideal, right? So from that standpoint, that's a desirable kind of thing. But there's other things that go into damage in a field, right? What's adjacent to it, or if you're looking at other species, sometimes it depends on having woodlands adjacent to your field or a lot of woodlands in the region, that kind of a thing. I'm just going to skip that. So again, the other thing we can do is the vegetation management. And so this is where you got to balance what we want from a wildlife damage perspective and then also what we're trying to do with cover crops and no-till and all that kind of stuff. But basically, if you're able to have a period of time, extend the period of time between terminating that cover crop and planting, that would be more ideal because there's less resources out there. So that could have an effect in terms of lowering vole populations. That's not always possible, right? Because there's a lot of factors that go into planting, the weather, moisture, all those kinds of things, your schedule, all those kinds of things, right? Availability of equipment and so on. Another thing we could do is tillage, and this is kind of a poor picture there, but sometimes with voles, we can create barriers. And so if we do some deep tillage around an area, maybe it's between the crop field and some more permanent habitat, you can create this kind of bare soil buffer that they're less likely to cross because they're going to be at risk for predation. That's another opportunity. So managing those adjacent habitats can be important. I already talked about this, and so there's always going to be trade-offs. But again, it really depends on what you're dealing with. If you more focus about voles, then you want to focus more on low cover, low density, those kinds of things. If you're more concerned about ground squirrels, then having the high, thick cover is more preferred. If you've got both, I don't know what to tell you. Flip a coin, right? Okay. Nikki, how am I doing on time? We're good? Okay. Okay, sounds good. 2 minutes until questions or 2 minutes for questions? Oh, okay. I'm gonna go ahead and end right here. But voles and squirrel, these things are really kind of minor players when it comes to crop damage. Deer and groundhogs are always the biggest players in soybean fields, and especially in northern Indiana, and deer and raccoon for cornfields as well. So that's only one part of the picture from that standpoint. I got a couple minutes for questions, and I'm happy to answer any that you have. Yes, sir.
Is there a product that is successful in deterring geese from eating in corn and soybean fields?
So the question was, is there a product successful to deter geese from eating in corn and soybean fields? No, there's nothing labeled for geese. When you deal with migratory birds, all the regulatory stuff, it's a lot more challenging. Yep. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, blackbirds, so they'll eat the tops of the corns, they'll peck out the kernels in the corn, they'll strip the husk, they'll open it up, absolutely, yep. We found damage in this particular study. This was in the upper Wabash River Valley region, probably about 50 to 70 miles east of here. And blackbirds were definitely a problem, but with the blackbirds, it was more focused in like a couple fields where they just really ravaged the field, but across the landscape, they weren't nearly as impactful as some of those other species, but they're definitely a problem. Yep, yep. Not much, really. Yeah, I mean, blackbirds, right? So birds are problematic because they can go a long way. So they can roost in one area and they can travel miles to feed in another area. So managing adjacent habitats isn't a reasonable approach for blackbirds. There are some toxicants that are like more scare devices for blackbirds where basically like some of them eat it and then the way they die is visually unpleasant, and so that's supposed to scare off the other ones. And that's done a lot of times. They do that in areas around when you got buildings and livestock and things like that. That's really not necessarily applied when you got a large field and they're spread out all over the things. There's really not much you can do. You can shoot them, but that's very inefficient, even though it might bring you some joy. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The voles wiped out my wife's hospice 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I put a base station out with rat poison, okay? And they didn't even touch it.
Right.
The zinc phosphate, that is something similar that I can put in the base station, and are they attracted to that?
Some of it like has like when you bait like in that with a bait station, you should pre-bait it. So pre-bait that bait station with nothing but something like rolled oats or the meats of sunflower seeds and feeding in there, and then start adding that bait component to it, right? That's really what you have to do. And the label directions should say that on the product itself. Yep, that's a good question. All right, I think I am out of time, right? I want to keep it. Yes, sir.
You said you was doing a lot of work in southern Indiana.
Yeah.
Are you getting wild hogs down there?
They're still in the area there in Lawrence County. That's kind of where they've primarily been limited to. But USDA Wildlife Services, for the last 3 years, they've been doing a trapping program down there trying to eradicate them. So we don't want wild hogs here. They're a big problem. So, all right, well, hey, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate it.